She did not hear the stagecoach driver abandon her. She did not hear the horses scream as the blizzard swallowed the trail whole. What Martha Collins heard in that final moment before the white world closed around her like a fist was her husband's voice. Not the howling wind, not the crack of ice-laden pine boughs overhead. Arthur's voice, smooth and surgical, as always, cutting through every layer of wool and pain and pride she had ever wrapped around herself. "You are an embarrassment, Martha. You have always taken up too much room." And as her knees buckled into the snow and the cold mercy of unconsciousness reached up to claim her, she found to her great and terrible shame that some part of her still believed him. If this story moves you the way it moves me, I want you to stay with me until the very last word. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now, let us begin. Denver, Colorado, October 1893. The city had always seemed to Martha like a place that was perpetually straightening its collar. It pressed its brick buildings close together along the wide avenues, as though bracing against some invisible judgment, dressed its ladies in narrow silhouettes of dark silk, and rewarded men who could speak with confidence about money they did not yet possess. It was, in short, a city built for men like Arthur Pendleton. And for 7 years Martha had allowed herself to believe it could be built for her too. She had been 24 when she married him, not a naive girl, but perhaps a hopeful one, which she had come to understand was a far more dangerous condition. She had brought to the marriage a modest but real dowry, the savings of her father, a Scots-Irish baker from Colorado Springs, who had kneaded bread before sunrise every morning of his adult life, and believed with the unshakable faith of the working poor that honest labor was its own inheritance. There had been among the papers and accounts her father had pressed into her hands on her wedding morning a single property deed. A logging way station up in the San Juan Mountains, a piece of land her father had accepted in lieu of payment from a grateful teamster years before, and then entirely forgotten. It was, he told her with a sheepish smile, probably worthless, a ruin on a rocky pass. But it was hers. Arthur had glanced at the deed, turned it over once in his manicured hands, and set it aside with the particular dismissiveness he reserved for things that did not immediately translate into social currency. For 7 years, Martha had cooked and managed and organized and attended the dinners and smiled at the right people and made herself as small as a powerfully built woman of her frame and her temperament could possibly make herself. She had an extraordinary talent in the kitchen, a nearly alchemical instinct for coaxing flavor from simple ingredients, for turning a bare pantry into a feast that made grown men close their eyes with something close to reverence. Arthur accepted this talent the way a man accepts a useful tool. He neither praised it nor acknowledged it as hers. He simply presented the results to his dinner guests as evidence of his own discerning taste. In the same way, he accepted her body only when it served him and criticized it at every other hour. It had not begun with cruelty. That was the thing about Arthur Pendleton that Martha would spend years trying to articulate to herself. It had begun with subtlety. A raised eyebrow when she reached for a second helping. A gentle, concerned hand on her arm in a dry goods store steering her away from a fabric he deemed unsuitable. Small corrections phrased as care. "You are so beautiful when you try, darling. I only say these things because I want the world to see what I see." And because Martha had grown up being told that a woman's body was a project requiring constant supervision, she had accepted his oversight as a form of love. By the time the cruelty became legible to her, she had already been trained not to trust her own reading of it. The autumn of 1893 unraveled everything with a swiftness that felt in retrospect almost merciful. The silver crash had been coming for months, a slow economic hemorrhage, As the government moved to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and men like Arthur, who had built paper fortunes on silver speculation, were already quiet with a particular kind of desperate quiet that Martha now recognized as the stillness before a man abandons ship. She did not learn the full scope of the disaster from Arthur. She learned it in pieces the way you learn about a fire when you begin to smell the smoke. A creditor appearing at the front door on a Thursday afternoon. A banker's letter she was not supposed to see left open on the writing desk. The slow disappearance of small luxuries from the household, the good candles, the weekly flour delivery, the cuts of meat that had seemed as permanent as furniture. And then she learned it all at once on a Thursday evening in late October when she came home from the market to find Arthur in the parlor with a woman she did not know. The woman was everything Denver society currently rewarded, narrow as a winter reed, fashionably pale, draped in a shade of blue that cost more than Martha's monthly household allowance. She sat in the good armchair with the easy confidence of someone who has never been made to feel that her presence required justification. Arthur did not stand when Martha entered. He looked at her across the room with an expression she had never seen on his face before, or perhaps had always seen and had simply refused to name. It was relief. The relief of a man who has finally decided to stop pretending. "Martha," he said in the tone one uses to address a situation rather than a person. "This is Cecilia Hartmore. We will be married in the spring." The room did not tilt. The floor did not fall away. Martha stood in her coat with her market basket on her arm and felt with a crystalline and terrible clarity every single year of the 7 she had spent making herself smaller than she was. She did not weep. Not then. She asked in a voice she barely recognized as her own about the accounts. About the household funds she had managed. Arthur informed her with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a slow child that the accounts were empty, that the house was leased in his name, that the investments she had believed to be secure had been liquidated months ago to service his debts, that she was, in the practical and legal sense of the word, left with nothing, almost nothing, the deed to the Mountain Way station. Worthless, he reminded her, tucking it into an envelope and sliding it across the table with the air of a man being more than generous. A ruin on a rocky pass in the San Juan Mountains. Good luck to her. Martha took the envelope. She picked up her market basket. And she walked out of the parlor, down the front steps, and into the cold Denver evening without looking back. Not because she was not devastated, but because she had learned in 7 years of marriage to Arthur Pendleton that the most dangerous thing she could do was let him see what was real in her. She had one friend in Denver, Louisa, who ran a respectable boarding house on the quieter end of Larimer Street, and who had, over the years, provided Martha with the only space in the city where she had ever been allowed to simply exist without apology. Louisa took her in without questions, fed her soup that Martha pretended to taste, and sat with her through the first night while the full weight of the betrayal settled into her bones like the cold settles into old stone. By morning, Martha had made the only decision available to a woman with no money, no family left in the city, and a deed to a piece of land in the mountains. She would go. Louisa argued. The season was wrong, she said. Late October in the San Juan Mountains was not the season for a woman alone to be making that journey. The passes could close without warning, and the high country in a bad year could turn from autumn to full winter in the span of an afternoon. Martha heard all of this. She also heard underneath Louisa's practical objections the other voice, the familiar one. You are not capable of this. You have never been capable. You take up too much space and do not have enough sense. She bought a ticket on the southbound stagecoach the following morning. The first 2 days of travel were hard but manageable. The road through Pueblo and into the foothills was well traveled, and the other passengers, 2 mining surveyors and a dry goods merchant were civil enough in the way of men who have learned that ignoring a woman is the most efficient form of coexistence. Martha sat with the deed pressed flat against the inside of her coat and watched the familiar plains give way to the first serious rises of the mountains, and she felt alongside the grief and the numbness something she had not felt in a very long time. The faint, stubborn stirring of ownership. This is going somewhere I belong to. Whatever it is, whatever condition it is, in it is mine. On the 3rd day the sky changed. She had grown up in Colorado. She knew what it meant when the high clouds moved with that particular urgency, when the light took on the flat silver quality of light filtered through ice crystals still forming miles above. She knew it the way she knew the smell of bread about to burn, a knowledge that lived in the body rather than the mind. She looked out the stagecoach window and felt her stomach drop. The driver felt it too. She could hear it in the pace of the horses, the way they had begun to move with that taut, nervous energy that animals carry when their instincts are screaming at them. The wind, which had been a steady cold presence all morning, began to arrive in gusts of a different character entirely. Not weather passing through, weather arriving to stay. By noon, the first real snow was falling. Not the gentle, scenic snow of postcard illustrations, but the dense, purposeful snow of a mountain storm that has decided to be thorough. Within an hour, the road ahead had become a matter of faith rather than visibility. Within 2 hours, the faith ran out. The stagecoach stopped on a stretch of road where the mountain rose sharply on one side and fell away into a white nothing on the other. Martha heard the driver shouting, heard the other passengers arguing. She pressed her face to the window and could see exactly nothing, just white. White in every direction, moving and shifting, and making a sound she had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully appreciated, the low, continuous roar of a blizzard, which is not the dramatic howl of a single gust, but the deep, committed voice of a storm that intends to outlast you. When the door opened and a blast of cold air hit her like a physical blow, she understood that the driver was not asking. He was informing. The horses could not continue. The road was impassable. There was, he told them, with the clipped efficiency of a man who had already calculated his own survival route, a settlement back down the mountain, perhaps 3 miles. He could not wait. He did not wait. Martha stood in the storm with her travel bag and her market basket and the deed pressed against her chest, and watched the stagecoach disappear back down the mountain. The 2 surveyors had gone with the driver. The merchant had gone with the surveyors. She had hesitated for 30 seconds too long, calculating, trying to determine whether 3 miles back down the mountain in a blizzard was more or less survivable than whatever lay ahead. In those 30 seconds, the stagecoach had gone. She started walking. She walked with her head down and her coat wrapped as tightly as she could manage, and her strong, capable legs working steadily through the snow, which was already past her ankles, and climbing. She had a direction. That was all. Forward and up, because the way station was somewhere up, and the mountain did not care about her situation one way or the other. And that indifference she found was in some terrible way a relief, after years of caring very much what Arthur Pendleton thought. The cold came for her in stages, first the fingers, then the feet, then the slow, insidious march of it up through her legs and into her core. She knew in the abstract clinical way one knows things when the body is in crisis that this was serious. She knew that the warmth she had begun to feel, the strange settling comfort of it, was not warmth at all, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. She thought of her father, of flour dust on his forearms, and the sound of a bread knife on a wooden board. She thought with a clarity that surprised her of how much she had always wanted to have a kitchen that was entirely her own. A hearth that she had built and stoked, and which warmed no one's ambitions but hers. She thought of the deed, still there against her chest, still warm from her body's last reserves. Her knees hit the snow, and she did not feel the impact. The white world closed around her, and Arthur's voice came back one final time, smooth and relentless, and she was too cold and too tired to argue with it, and so she simply let it speak, the way you let a storm speak when there is no shelter left. And she thought with the last clear thought she had before the dark that she was sorry. Not for anything she had done, but for all the years she had spent believing him. She did not hear the footsteps. She did not hear the low, steady voice that cut through the wind with the practiced authority of a man who has spent years speaking to mountains and has learned to make himself heard. She did not feel herself being lifted. She felt eventually warmth. Not the false warmth of the cold's final mercy, but real warmth. The warmth of a body that was large and solid and certain, a warmth that pressed against her back and her shoulders and her cold hands, and did not flinch, a warmth so complete and so steady that it reached through the layers of cold and exhaustion and grief, and found the living part of her, and said without words, simply, "You are not finished." Martha Collins opened her eyes once in the dark in a warm and unfamiliar place, and saw the orange flicker of a good well-built fire, and felt the steady rhythm of breathing that was not her own, and closed her eyes again. She did not think of Arthur. For the first time in 7 years, she did not think of Arthur at all. The cabin was small. She would understand this more fully later, when she was capable of understanding anything fully. What she understood now, drifting in and out of a sleep so deep it had weight, was that she was alive, that the fire was real, that the warmth against her back, the patient, enormous warmth, belonged to a person who had not moved, who showed no indication of moving, who had apparently decided with the same quiet certainty with which mountains decide to remain mountains that keeping her alive was simply what needed to be done, and therefore he would do it. When she finally surfaced into full wakefulness, it was to the sound of wood being fed into a stove, and the smell of something that might have been venison broth, and the gray light of a mountain morning coming through a single small window, and the awareness that she was in a bed that was not hers, wearing dry clothes that were not hers, in a cabin that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and the particular animal warmth of a small space that a large man has occupied for a long time. She turned her head. He was sitting at the table with his back partially to her feeding wood into the belly of the cast-iron stove, with the economical movements of a man who has performed this action 10,000 times. He was, she registered, very large. Not in the soft, cultivated way of Arthur's business associates, who were large with prosperity and indoor living, but in the way of the mountains themselves. Broad across the shoulders and back in a manner that suggested not muscle assembled for display, but muscle built by actual use by years of felling timber and freighting loads, and doing the physical arithmetic of survival at elevation. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and when he turned to check on the stove, she could see the scar along his jaw, a long, pale line that spoke of old violence or old accident, she could not yet tell which. He turned and found her looking at him. His eyes were the color of the mountain sky in late autumn. Not the bright summer blue, but the deeper, more serious blue of a sky that has decided to mean business. They were above everything else calm, not the studied calm of a man performing composure, but the genuine calm of a man who has long since made his peace with the fact that the world is difficult and has elected to deal with it steadily rather than dramatically. "You are awake," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that does not waste itself on extra words. "Yes," Martha said, and was surprised by how much effort even that single syllable required. "You were in the storm," he said. "On the Alamosa Pass Road. I found you." He paused, considered whether more explanation was required, apparently decided it was not. "There is broth." Martha looked at the ceiling. She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands, which were wrapped in clean cloth, the fingers pink with returning circulation. Someone had been very careful with her hands. "Thank you," she said. He brought the broth. He did not hover. He set the cup where she could reach it and returned to the table, and the simplicity of that, the complete absence of performance in it, was so foreign to her recent experience of being cared for that it took her a moment to recognize it as kindness. She drank the broth. It was extraordinary, simple and deep, and made with patience. Outside, the storm continued to speak in the voice she had learned to fear. Inside the small cabin, the fire answered it steadily, and Martha Collins lay in a borrowed bed, holding a warm cup in her carefully wrapped hands, and felt with a confusion that was not unpleasant that she had been deposited at the beginning of something rather than the end. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know the shape of the months ahead, the barter and the building, the slow revolutionary work of reclaiming a self that had been systematically dismantled. She did not know about the carved armchair that would eventually stand beside the hearth built to hold her exactly as she was, not as someone had decided she ought to be. She knew only the broth and the fire and the steady breathing of a man who had carried her out of the snow without being asked, and had not since that moment made her feel that this was anything she should be ashamed of. It was Martha Collins thought a beginning. The storm lasted 4 more days. Martha knew this not because she counted them with any particular intention, but because she watched the window. It was the only window in the cabin, a small square of glass set into the south-facing wall above the table, and it became in those first days of her recovery the axis around which her waking hours organized themselves. When the light through it was the flat, directionless white of a storm still in progress, she stayed in the bed. When it shifted to the harder, more specific gray of a storm, losing conviction, she sat up. When it finally broke on the morning of the 5th day into the blinding, almost aggressive clarity that follows a major mountain snowfall, she stood for the first time, gripped the rough wooden bedpost, and understood the full extent of what her body had endured. Her legs held. They were unsteady and protesting, but they held. She was, she thought, with the first flicker of something that was not quite yet pride, but was moving in that direction still here. The man's name was Ezekiel Shaw. She learned this not from an introduction in any formal sense, because Ezekiel Shaw did not appear to operate in any formal sense, but from a letter she saw lying open on the table on the 2nd day, addressed to him in the care of the mountain freight office in the settlement below. She did not read the letter. She simply registered the name, turned it over in her mind, and found that it suited him in the way that certain things suit certain landscapes. It was a name with weight to it, a name that did not apologize for taking up space. He was, she gathered over those 4 days, a man of formidable physical capability and very few unnecessary words. He freighted supplies up the mountain passes for the mining camps, a brutal occupation that required not only strength, but the specific intelligence of a man who understands load distribution, weather reading, and the psychology of mules. In the off-season, when the highest passes became impassable, he logged. He hunted. He maintained his cabin and his equipment with a thoroughness that spoke of a man who had learned at some cost that the mountains do not forgive deferred maintenance. He slept on the floor beside the stove on a bedroll he assembled each night, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a soldier in the field, and disassembled each morning before she was fully awake, as though he were trying to minimize the evidence of his own sacrifice. Martha noticed this. She noticed the deliberate way he always positioned the stove's warmth toward the bed rather than toward the floor. She noticed that when he brought her food, he always brought slightly more than he took for himself, and was quiet about it in the way of a man who does not want gratitude to complicate a simple decision. On the 3rd day, she tried to give him the bed back. "You should sleep in your own bed," she said when he was assembling the bedroll for the 3rd consecutive night. "I am well enough to sleep on the floor." He looked at her for a moment. It was not an unkind look. It was the look of a man considering whether an argument is worth having and arriving at a conclusion. "No," he said, that was all. Just no delivered in the same tone he might use to assess weather or judge a trail's condition. A statement of fact rather than a negotiation. Martha had prepared several reasonable follow-up arguments. She did not use any of them. There was something in his certainty that disarmed the habit of protest she had developed as a survival strategy in her marriage, the constant negotiation, the careful management of another person's ego. Ezekiel Shaw had no ego that she could identify. He had simply looked at the situation, determined what was right and done it, and if she had opinions about it, she was welcome to have them in silence. She got back into the bed. "Thank you," she said for the second time. He gave a single nod, the abbreviated acknowledgement of a man who considers "thank you" a reasonable response to a reasonable action and nothing more, and turned back to the stove. It was on the fourth day that she told him about the deed. She had been sitting at the table, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, watching him prepare a meal with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and she had felt the deed against her chest, where she had taken to keeping it tucked inside the borrowed shirt she wore, and she had thought, "This is mine," and he should know that because she was sitting in his home and eating his food and sleeping in his bed, and he deserved to understand that she had not arrived with nothing. She pulled it from her shirt and laid it on the table. "I have property," she said, "on this pass, the old logging way station. I have the deed." He turned from the stove. He looked at the deed. He did not reach for it immediately, which she appreciated, because it was hers, and she had not offered it to him, only shown it to him. After a moment he dried his hands on the cloth hanging from his belt and came to the table and read it where it lay, bending slightly to do so. "Hargrove Way Station," he said. "Yes. Do you know it? It is 200 yards up the pass." He straightened. Something moved behind those autumn sky eyes, a calculation of some kind, a rapid private assessment she did not yet have the vocabulary to read. "The roof went in 2 winters back. The east wall is compromised. The well is likely frozen solid." Martha looked at the deed. She smoothed it once with her palm, a small proprietary gesture. "Then I have work to do," she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man revising something. "You cannot go there until spring," he said finally. "Not in this winter. The structure as it stands would not hold heat." "I understand that. You can stay here until it is livable." He said it the way he said most things, not as an offer exactly, more as an assessment. The situation required this solution. He was providing it. The simplicity of it, the complete absence of condescension or performance in it, made Martha's throat tighten in a way she had not anticipated. "I would not want to impose," she said, and heard even as she said it the particular quality of those words, the trained smallness of them, the reflex. Ezekiel Shaw looked at her steadily for a moment. He had the quality she was beginning to notice of a man who listens not only to what is said, but to the distance between what is said and what is meant, as though years of reading weather and terrain had trained him to attend to what a thing was communicating beneath its surface. "This cabin has the room," he said. "The winter has the cold. Those are the facts." He paused. "You are not an imposition." He turned back to the stove. The conversation was apparently complete. Martha looked at the deed on the table and felt something loosen very slightly in the locked and guarded center of her chest. She stayed. In the days that followed, as the storm's aftermath settled into the hard, clear cold of a San Juan winter proper, they developed the wordless choreography of 2 people sharing a small space. It was easier than Martha would have expected, and she spent some time trying to understand why before arriving at the uncomfortable truth that it was easy, because Ezekiel Shaw required nothing from her. Not performance, not management, not the constant monitoring of his emotional weather that had constituted the primary labor of her marriage. He moved through the cabin with the calm purposefulness of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why, and he made space for her in that calm, without comment, without the pointed sighs and loaded silences that had been Arthur's preferred instruments of governance. He gave her tasks when she was strong enough to do them, not because he was delegating, but because she had asked, and because he seemed to understand, without her having to explain it, that a woman of her disposition would find convalescent idleness more taxing than any physical labor. She could not do the heavy work yet, the wood-splitting and the hauling, but she could manage the fire, and she could cook. And the first time she took over the production of the evening meal, she saw something shift in his face when he tasted it. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of quality encountered unexpectedly. He ate in silence for a moment. Then he said, "You are a remarkable cook." It was perhaps the most uncomplicated compliment she had ever received. No qualification, no asterisk, no implication that the accomplishment was surprising given her other deficiencies. Just the fact stated plainly by a man who was plainly not in the habit of saying things he did not mean. Martha looked at her own hands on the table. "My father was a baker," she said. "He taught me that good food is not complicated. It is patient." "Yes," said Ezekiel Shaw, and returned to his meal. The cabin was, as she had initially registered, small. She had grown up in modest circumstances and was not by nature a woman who required expansive surroundings. But she was a woman who had been made to feel with consistent and insidious regularity that her body was too large for the space available to it. Arthur's townhouse had been adequately sized for a family of 4 and had somehow always managed to communicate that Martha was straining its seams. He had been masterful at this, at the architecture of inadequacy. A narrowly set chair, a remark about doorways, small violence, each one deniable in isolation. In Ezekiel's cabin, the opposite was true, and it took her nearly a week to identify why. He had built the place himself, she learned, or largely rebuilt it, taking a structure that had been thrown up by a previous occupant and systematically improving it over 3 winters. The doorways were wide because he himself was wide across the shoulders and had built them to his own dimensions. The table was solid and generous because a man who works with his hands needs a real surface to work on. The chair by the fire was built low and broad, with armrests set wide apart, built for a man who came home tired and needed to sit in a way that actually supported his body. She sat in that chair one evening while he cleaned and oiled his rifle at the table, and for the first time in longer than she could calculate, she did not feel the specific anxiety of fitting. The chair held her. Not despite her dimensions, but because of them, or rather without any consideration of them at all. She was a person who needed to sit, and the chair was a place to sit. It was an absurdly simple thing, and it undid her quietly in a way she could not show. She learned more about him in the incremental way of people who share close quarters through a long winter. He was 34. He had grown up in the mountains, the son of a Welsh immigrant miner who had come west with plans for silver and found instead a profession in timber. He had the scar on his jaw from a logging accident at 22 that had very nearly killed him, and which he mentioned exactly once and with the neutral tone of a man citing a weather event. He had been in these mountains for more than 10 years. He knew them the way some men know Scripture, not as a collection of facts, but as a living text, always being revised, always demanding attention. She came to understand profoundly and genuinely content in his solitude. Not because he was indifferent to human connection, but because he had a very clear sense of what he valued and was not willing to dilute it with company that did not meet that standard. This made the hospitality he extended to her feel again not like charity, but like acknowledgment. He had looked at her, the freezing woman in the snow, and seen something worth keeping alive. And what he had seen, she was slowly and tentatively beginning to believe was not a burden he had taken on, but a presence he had chosen to extend. He said very little about her directly. He was not a man for declarations. But she noticed the quality of his attention, the way his eyes tracked her across the cabin, with the same focused, unhurried interest he brought to reading the sky or checking the soundness of a beam. Not hunger, or not only hunger, though she was not so grief-numb as to be entirely unaware of the current that ran under his steadiness. It was something more fundamental than hunger. It was regard. One morning, about 2 weeks into her stay, she caught him looking at her while she worked at the stove. She was making biscuits, and she had removed her outer coat because the work was warm, and she was wearing the spare shirt of his that she had been given, which fit her across the shoulders, in a way her own tailored things rarely had, and she could feel the warmth of the stove and the rhythm of the work in her arms and the particular satisfaction of a dough that was coming together correctly. She turned and found him watching. He did not look away. He was not, she was learning, a man who looked away from things because they were inconvenient. "What is it?" she asked. He considered for a moment. "You are different," he said, "when you are cooking." "Different how?" "You stop apologizing." He said it simply, without accusation, as an observation offered for her consideration. "You forget to be sorry for yourself." Martha turned back to the biscuits. Her hands kept moving the practiced fold and turn, fold and turn. The fire spoke steadily in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines with the low, continuous sound of something very old making itself known. "I did not realize I was doing that," she said. "I know," said Ezekiel. "That is the part that concerns me." She did not answer. She did not know how to answer. But she thought about those words for a very long time afterward, turning them over with the same careful attention she gave to a piece of dough that needed understanding. He was not wrong. She apologized for her presence with a fluency that had long since ceased to feel like apology and had become simply the texture of her being. She apologized when she woke because waking meant existing in his space. She apologized when she was hungry because hunger required acknowledgement. She apologized for the cold when she opened the door as though the weather were something she had failed to properly manage. And in the kitchen, in the act of making something, she forgot. The competence of her hands outran the habit of her diminishment. For 20 minutes, for 30, she was simply a person doing a thing she was good at, and the self-erasure did not exist. And she was, as he had observed with the precision of a man accustomed to reading landscapes, entirely different. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it while the biscuits baked, and while Ezekiel went out to check the line of traps he kept along the timber edge, and while the cabin breathed around her with the small sounds of a structure doing its job against the cold. She thought about what it meant that her most essential self, the self that was capable and creative and deeply stubbornly alive, only surfaced fully in the moments when she forgot to be ashamed of existing. Arthur had done that, not in a single blow, because single blows leave evidence, in the patient daily cumulative way of water on stone. A raised eyebrow here, a pointed silence there. A redirect when she spoke too long, correction when her laugh was too loud a concern, always phrased as care that she was taking up too much of whatever room she happened to be in. 7 years of water on stone. She pulled the biscuits from the oven. They were perfect, golden across the tops and soft through the center, and smelling of the good rendered fat she had found in his larder, and she set them on the table and looked at them, and felt for reasons she could not entirely explain, like weeping. She did not weep. She was becoming, she noticed, incrementally less willing to diminish in front of Ezekiel Shaw, not because he made her feel judged for it, but because he so clearly did not expect it of her. His expectation, insofar as she could read it in his careful, economical way of being in the world, was simply that she was a person of substance and would conduct herself accordingly. It was a strange and unfamiliar expectation. She was finding slowly that she wanted to meet it. Ezekiel came back from the trap line with 2 rabbits and snow on his shoulders and stopped in the doorway when the smell of the biscuits reached him. He stood there for a moment in a way that was almost comically large, his frame filling the doorway he had built for himself, the cold air coming in around him, and looked at the table. "Sit down," Martha said. "They are hot." He came in. He sat. He ate 2 biscuits before he had even removed his coat, and she watched the expression on his scarred, serious face with something she cautiously identified as satisfaction. Real satisfaction. The satisfaction of a person whose gift has been genuinely received, and she thought for the first time in 7 years that maybe, just possibly, she was exactly the right size for the life that was waiting for her. Winter in the San Juan Mountains does not release its grip gently. It does not gradually soften the way winter does in the lower country, easing through a polite progression of warming days and retreating snow. It holds and holds and holds, and then one morning you step outside, and there is something different in the air, not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth. A rumor passed between the rocks and the pine needles, and you understand that the season has made a decision. It is a shift you feel in the body before you see it in the landscape, and Martha felt it on a morning in late February when she opened Ezekiel's cabin door to bring in wood and stood for a moment with the cold air on her face, and knew with the same instinct that had always told her when dough was ready that something was changing. She had been on the mountain for 4 months. She stood in the doorway and took inventory of herself the way she had learned to take inventory of a larder honestly and without sentiment. She was stronger than she had been in Denver. Genuinely stronger, not in the aspirational sense that women's magazines prescribed, but in the real functional sense of a body that had been asked to do actual work and had responded. Her arms, always substantial, had developed a new quality of capability. Her legs carried her across the icy yard between the cabin and the woodpile with a sureness that was partly practice and partly something harder to name, a reclaiming of terrain both literal and otherwise. She was also, she had noticed over the past weeks, beginning to inhabit her body differently. Less like a guest apologizing for the room she required. More like a resident. The shift was subtle, but it was real, and she could trace its origins at least partially to Ezekiel Shaw and the completely matter-of-fact way in which he occupied his own considerable physical presence. He never seemed to register that his body was a problem to be managed. He simply used it the way you use a good tool, with respect for its capabilities and without apology for its dimensions, and some of that, living in close quarters with him all winter, had apparently transferred to her the way warmth transfers through shared walls. He had been working on the way station. She had suspected it for weeks before she confirmed it. He left the cabin each morning in the direction of the timber line, which was consistent with his trap line and his logging work. But he came back some evenings with a different quality of sawdust on his coat, a different distribution of effort in his movements. He did not mention it. She did not ask, partly because she was learning to read his rhythms, and partly because something in her understood that if she asked too directly, he might stop, not out of secrecy, but out of the particular reticence of a man who does good things without wanting to be watched doing them. She confirmed it on an afternoon when he had gone down the mountain to the freight office, and she walked the 200 yards up the pass to the Hargrove Way station alone for the first time. She had seen it briefly in late autumn from the Stagecoach Road, a sagging structure of dark timber, the roof visibly compromised. On the east side, the main door hanging at an angle that suggested the frame had shifted. What she saw now was something different. The roof had been patched, not hastily but thoroughly, with timber that had been properly cut and fitted the new wood pale against the weathered gray of the old. The east wall had been shored up with fresh framing, the structural problem addressed from the outside with the kind of work that requires both knowledge and considerable physical effort in the worst months of winter. The door had been rehung and sat level in its frame. The windows, of which there were two, had been temporarily boarded against the cold, but the boarding was clean and tight, done with care. Martha stood in front of the way station in the late February light and felt something rise in her chest that she had difficulty categorizing. It was not simply gratitude, though it was that. It was not simply surprise, though it was that too. It was the particular emotion of a person who has been told repeatedly and persuasively that they are not worth significant effort encountering evidence to the contrary in physical and undeniable form. He had done this in the deep cold. He had done it without being asked and without mentioning it. He had looked at her deed, at her ruined property, at her specific and particular need, and had simply begun addressing it the way he addressed everything that needed doing, with steady, quiet competence and no fanfare. She pressed her hand flat against the new timber on the east wall. It was solid under her palm, deliberate and real. When Ezekiel came back that evening and found her already preparing supper with an expression he had not seen before, he set down his pack and read the room with the attentiveness he brought to reading terrain, and said nothing for a moment. "The east wall," Martha said without turning from the stove. "The roof, the door." A pause. The structure needed it. "Ezekiel." He waited. She turned and looked at him directly, which she had learned was the only way to have a real conversation with a man who read directness as respect. "Thank you," she said, not as a courtesy, as a true thing. He held her gaze for a moment in the way he had, level and unhurried, and gave a nod that was small in size and large in what it carried. Then he took off his coat and came to see what she was making, and the subject was closed, but the thing it represented was not closed at all. It lived in the cabin with them through the remaining weeks of winter, warm and unspoken, the way certain important things live between people who are not yet ready to name them. Spring came to the San Juan Mountains in the first week of April, which in that country meant the snow was still present, but no longer absolute, retreating to the north-facing slopes and the deep shade under the pines, while the south-facing rock faces began to show bare stone, and the first tentative suggestions of something green. It was not a comfortable spring. It was a mountain spring, which means it was a daily negotiation between the season that was leaving and the season that had not yet fully arrived, with cold nights and mud and the particular chaos of snowmelt turning the pass road into something that was only theoretically a road. It was also, as it happened, the season in which the full weight of the 1893 silver crash came down on the communities of the San Juan High Country. Martha had understood the crash in the abstract through the winter. She had lived its personal consequences in Denver. But the abstract became viscerally concrete in April, when the first groups of miners began coming through the pass, heading down from the high camps that were shutting operations, carrying what they could on their backs, and in carts, their faces carrying the specific hollowness of men who had worked hard and lost everything through no failure of their own labor. They came in twos and threes at first, and then in larger groups, and they were almost without exception hungry. The way station sat directly on the pass road. Martha had been spending her days there since the first week of March, working through the interior with the same methodical attention Ezekiel had given to the structure. She had cleared it, cleaned it, assessed what remained functional and what needed replacing. The great central hearth was sound, a massive stone construction that had been built to heat a space where men came in frozen from the mountain work and needed to be thawed quickly and completely. The main room was large enough, with its broad plank floor and high-beamed ceiling, to serve a substantial number of people at once. She watched the first group of miners come through on a Tuesday morning, 4 men with the look of the genuinely desperate about them, and she made a decision. She had no money to buy supplies. She had Ezekiel's hunted game, which he gave freely, and she had her own skills, which were considerable, and she had the hearth. What she needed was labor, because the way station still lacked the furniture and equipment that would make it functional as a proper establishment. The building was sound. The hearth was sound. Everything else remained to be built, or sourced, or hauled up the mountain. She stepped out onto the way station's front step as the 4 miners came abreast of it. "I cannot pay you in money," she said without preamble, because men in that condition did not need preamble. "I can pay you in meals, real meals, hot and substantial, 3 times a day. In exchange, I need labor, furniture, built equipment hauled whatever this establishment requires to function." She let them look at the building at the smoke, already beginning to rise from the chimney she had started earlier that morning. "There is venison stew inside right now. If you want to discuss terms, we can do that at the table." All 4 men came inside. By the end of the first week, she had 11 men working in exchange for meals. By the end of the second week, she had a functioning kitchen with a proper work table and 2 additional stoves hauled up from the settlement below. By the end of the third week, the way station had rough-hewn tables and benches enough to seat 30, a repaired well with clean water, a storage room properly stocked through the barter of goods the men carried down from the closing camps, flour and salt and dried beans, and the tools of mining trades she had no use for but could trade in turn at the settlement. Ezekiel watched all of this with the expression of a man who is surprised in a way that does not diminish him. He contributed to it practically, and without being directed, appearing at the way station each morning to assess what structural problems had emerged, and addressing them with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He did not manage her operation. He did not offer opinions on how she ran it unless she asked. He simply made himself available for the physical problems that exceeded the capacity of the miners currently in residence, and in the evenings he brought game. And in return, Martha fed him at the end of the service day, at the table by the hearth, in the manner of the last meal before something important happens, which it always felt like those evenings, though she had not yet allowed herself to examine why. The men called her Mrs. Collins. They said it with a respect that was not social courtesy, but the earned respect of people who have been genuinely fed when they were genuinely hungry, which is one of the oldest forms of debt humans recognize. They were rough men, most of them shaped by years of underground work and the radical democracy of mining camps, where a man was valued for what he could do, and not at all for what he could pretend to be. They were not unkind. Several of them had wives somewhere below families they were trying to get back to, and in Martha's way. Stationed, they found something that was not their homes, but was in the direction of home, warm and fed and decent, and they worked for it with a willingness that moved her. It was a miner named Corbett, a broad-chested Irishman from County Clare, who had been in the Colorado mountains for 8 years, who said the thing that lodged itself permanently in Martha's understanding of herself. She had been hauling a sack of flour from the storage room to the kitchen, a substantial sack, and she had done it without thinking, hoisted it to her shoulder, and carried it with the ease of a woman who had been doing physical work all winter, and whose body had responded to that work by becoming genuinely capable. Corbett had seen her do it and had made a sound of sincere admiration. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Collins," he said in his rolling Clare accent, "but you are a formidable woman. I mean that as the highest possible praise." Martha had set the flour down and looked at him. She was breathing from the work, and her hair was escaping from its arrangement, and she was wearing the practical clothes she had sewn herself over the winter cut for movement and labor, rather than for appearance. And she realized in that moment entirely without the self-consciousness that had attended every physical moment of her life in Denver. "Thank you, Mr. Corbett," she said, and meant it without qualification. That evening she did something she had not done since Denver. She looked at herself in the mirror that hung above the washstand in the way station's back room, a cracked and tarnished thing that one of the miners had found in the camp debris and brought down as partial payment. She looked at herself the way she might look at a piece of land she was considering without sentiment and without predetermined conclusion, just assessment. She was powerfully built. She had always known this in the abstract, but had spent so long seeing it through Arthur's eyes that the knowledge had become inseparable from shame. Standing in the back room of her own establishment, in the clothes she had made for her own purposes, after a day of real work that had fed 30 men, she looked at the considerable substance of herself and thought with a clarity that was almost physical. In its force, he was wrong. He was simply completely and deliberately wrong. The woman in the cracked mirror was not a ruin. She was not an excess or an embarrassment or a space-taking problem in need of correction. She was a woman whose body was built for exactly the life she was living, wide-shouldered enough to carry real loads, strong-armed enough to knead the bread that fed the desperate and the hungry, solid enough to stand in a mountain winter and not break. Where Arthur had looked at her and seen something requiring apology, the mountains had looked at her and simply put her to work, and the work had fit her like a coat made to measure. She discarded the oversized outer coat she had been wearing since Denver, the one she had habitually used to make herself look smaller, less present, easier to overlook. She hung it on a peg in the storage room and did not take it down again. It was Ezekiel who noticed. Of course it was Ezekiel who noticed. He noticed everything, in that quiet, unhurried way of his, cataloging the world around him with the patience of a man who has learned that attention is the most important survival tool available. She had come to the end of the service day and walked out the front door of the way station into the spring evening without the coat wearing. Instead, the fitted wool dress she had completed just that week cut properly for her figure and not against it. The evening was cold but not brutal, the particular cold of a mountain spring that has made its concessions to warmth and is holding the line there. She stood on the step and looked down the pass road at the last light on the high peaks, and felt the cold air directly on her shoulders and arms, and it felt for reasons she could not entirely articulate, like a form of honesty. Ezekiel came out behind her and stood beside her on the step. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth he generated, which was considerable. He looked at the peaks the way he always looked at them, with the specific quality of attention a man gives to something he has agreed to spend his life in conversation with. After a while, he said without making a point of it, "New dress." "I made that," she said, "this winter." Another moment of mountain quiet. The light on the peaks was turning from gold to the deep amber that precedes purple. "It suits you," he said. And the simplicity of it, the complete absence of any asterisk or qualification, was so different from every compliment she had been trained to wait for that it took her a moment to receive it properly. Not "it suits you despite," not "it would suit you more if." Just the clean declarative fact of it delivered by a man who did not traffic in things he did not mean. Martha looked at the high peaks in their evening colors and felt the cold on her arms and the solid wood of the step under her feet, and the warmth of the man beside her, and thought of the way station behind her, her way station, her hearth, her deed, her work, and felt rising in her chest something she recognized finally, after 7 years of its absence, as the specific and irreducible warmth of a person who has come home. She did not say any of this. They stood together on the step in the mountain evening until the light failed and the cold made its authority felt. And then they went back inside, and Martha set the kettle on the stove, and Ezekiel brought in the last wood of the day, and the hearth held the warmth between them like something cupped in capable hands. He arrived on a Thursday. Martha knew it was a Thursday because Corbett always played his battered tin whistle on Thursday evenings after supper, a habit the other men had come to look forward to in the way that small rituals become important when larger certainties have been stripped away. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse on the pass road, a single horse moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has calculated his arrival for effect. She did not look up immediately. Horses came through the pass regularly, now that the spring mud had firmed enough to make the road passable, miners still trickling down from the closing camps, occasional freight wagons working the mountain routes. But Corbett stopped playing. That was what made her look up, not the horse, the silence where the tin whistle had been. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked through the main room to the open front door where the last of the evening light was coming in at a low angle, and she saw the silhouette of a man dismounting at the way station's front step with the studied elegance of someone who has always believed that other people should be watching when he moves. He was dressed for the city, a good coat, dark wool cut close. Boots that had been expensive before the mountain road had an opinion about them. He was lean and arranged, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never fully accepted that his confidence might not be warranted. Martha knew the shape of that confidence. She had lived adjacent to it for 7 years. Arthur Pendleton stepped through the door of the Hargrove way station and looked around the room with the expression of a man who has arrived to assess a property and is already composing his offer. His eyes moved across the miners at their tables, across the firelight, and the rough-hewn furniture, and the evidence of a functioning living establishment. And Martha could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid, ruthless arithmetic of a man repricing something he had previously discounted. Then he saw her in the kitchen doorway, and the calculation resolved itself into something else. Into the particular smile she had once believed was warmth and now recognized as the expression a man wears when he has decided the angle of his approach. "Martha," he said. He said it the way he said most things, as though her name were something he was doing her a favor by pronouncing. "My darling, you look extraordinarily well." The room was very quiet. The miners at the tables had gone still with the specific attentive stillness of men who have learned to read the arrival of trouble. Martha did not move from the kitchen doorway. She was aware in a distant and almost academic way of the fact that her heart was not pounding. She had expected it to pound. 7 years of conditioning had prepared her for the physical fact of Arthur, for the way his presence had always been able to reorganize her internal weather without her permission. Instead, she felt something that took her a moment to identify because it was so unfamiliar in relation to him. She felt clear. "Arthur," she said, "what are you doing here?" It was not a question. She had learned over the winter and the spring the difference between sentences that ask and sentences that simply require an account, and she delivered this one in the latter category in a tone that was flat and informational and entirely without the deferential softening she had once automatically applied to every word she directed at him. Something shifted in his eyes, a small recalibration. He had expected she understood the old Martha, the Martha who would have been flustered by his appearance, apologetic, grateful for his attention, her defenses already softened by the complicated grief of seeing him again. He had traveled up a mountain to find that Martha. The woman standing in the kitchen doorway was not cooperating with his plan. "I came to see you," he said, spreading his hands in the gesture of openness she had once found reassuring, and now saw for what it was, a performance of transparency from a man who had never been transparent in his life. "When I heard you had come up here, I was worried sick, Martha. Truly, A woman alone in these conditions with nothing but a ruined building and no resources. He shook his head with the expression of a man bearing the weight of genuine concern. I have been blaming myself. Have you? Martha said. You must believe that. He moved into the room, unhurrying, nodding pleasantly at the miners the way a man nods at set furniture. He reached the table nearest her and rested his hand on its back, the proprietary gesture of a man establishing spatial claim. And then I heard what you had accomplished here. And Martha, I cannot tell you how proud I was, how relieved. The smile again, warm and constructed, and aimed like a tool. You have always been resourceful. I always said that. He had not, in fact, ever said that. What he had said consistently and in various formulations was that she was impractical, emotional, and unsuited for the management of anything more complex than a kitchen. Martha let this discrepancy sit between them without comment. You should have written, she said, before coming. I wanted to surprise you. He paused. Then, with the careful offhandedness of a man placing a card he has been holding for some time. Also, I had some business in the area. There are railroad men making surveys through this pass. Did you know that, apparently, this particular route has become rather interesting to certain parties in the Denver and Rio Grande organization? He looked around the room again with the air of a man noticing for the first time how central this location actually was. Remarkable timing, really. Your little establishment sitting right here on the most promising survey line. There it was. Martha had not known about the railroad survey specifically, but she understood as soon as he said it that this was the entire architecture of his visit. Not concern for her, not guilt. Not the belated conscience of a man who had discarded his wife in a season of financial ruin and wished to make amends. A railroad right-of-way through the pass would require acquisition of the properties along the survey line, and the most significant property directly on that line was the Hargrove way station, her deed. She looked at her former husband and felt beneath the clarity a cold and steady anger. Not the hot, destabilizing anger of betrayal which she had already spent and which had served its purpose in getting her out of Denver and up the mountain. This was the colder, more durable anger of a person who sees exactly what is happening and refuses to pretend otherwise. The deed is in my name, she said, my father's name before mine. It has always been in my name. Of course it has, Arthur said warmly. Of course, and you should be enormously proud of what you have done with the property, truly. But Martha, when he tilted his head with the gentle, concerned expression she recognized as the prelude to the most dangerous kind of pressure he applied. This is a significant legal and financial negotiation. Railroad companies have lawyers. They have processes and procedures and technical requirements that are frankly complex and exhausting for someone without experience in these matters. A pause calibrated for effect. I only want to protect you. I always have. You know how easily these things can become overwhelming. She heard it with perfect clarity. Every word chosen and placed like a stone in a particular wall. Not the cartoonish insults of a villain, because Arthur was far too intelligent for cartoonish insults. The insults were architectural. Built into the structure of the concern. Significant legal and financial negotiation. Someone without experience. Easily overwhelming. Each phrase a small, careful undermining. Each one phrased as care. You are not capable of this. You have never been capable. Let me handle it. Let me take what you have built on the grounds that you are not equipped to hold it. She had heard this voice for 7 years. She had believed it for most of those years. She had carried it into a blizzard and nearly died with it whispering in her ear. Standing in her own kitchen doorway in her own establishment with flour on her hands from her own bread, she heard it for what it was. Not truth, not concern. A tool. The most refined tool in Arthur Pendleton's limited repertoire, applied with practiced precision to the specific vulnerabilities he had spent 7 years mapping in her. "You are welcome to have supper," she said. "The rate is the same for everyone." She turned back to the kitchen. "After that, you are welcome to make your way back down the mountain." She heard the change in the room behind her. The quality of silence from the miners' tables shifted the way silence shifts when a group of people simultaneously decides where its sympathies lie. She did not look back. Arthur ate supper. He was too strategic to leave immediately, because leaving immediately would have conceded the field, and Arthur never conceded fields voluntarily. He sat at a table and ate, and made pleasant conversation with the men around him, and Martha could hear from the kitchen the social performance of him, the practiced ease, the self-deprecating humor that had once made her believe he was a better man than he was. Ezekiel came in from the freight road at dusk the way he usually did at the end of the day, and stopped in the doorway when he read the room. Martha watched him through the kitchen pass through, watched his eyes move across the space and locate Arthur at the table, and register the situation with the rapid, accurate assessment she had come to rely on the way you rely on a well-built compass. His jaw tightened, one precise, controlled contraction. And then his face settled back into its habitual steadiness, and he came inside and removed his coat and came to the kitchen. "He is here about the railroad survey," Martha said quietly, before Ezekiel could say anything. Ezekiel looked at her. "You know?" "I worked it out." He watched her face for a moment with that attentive reading quality she had first noticed in the depths of winter. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy something, because he gave the small nod and reached past her for the coffee pot, with the easy familiarity of a man who has shared a kitchen long enough to know where things live. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to know if the deed is solid," she said, "if there is anything in the paperwork he could use." Ezekiel drank his coffee. He had, over the months she had known him, revealed his knowledge of Western land and claim law in pieces the way a man reveals competence when it is needed, rather than displaying it for admiration. She knew it was substantial. She knew he had navigated the freight company's claims and land access questions with a precision that had occasionally surprised the company lawyers in Durango. "I would need to see the deed again," he said, "and I would need to know what survey corridor the railroad is using. Can you find out?" "Yes." Arthur stayed through the next morning. He had predictably nowhere comfortable to sleep on the mountain, and had accepted with gracious reluctance the spare room that Martha had thus far been using for storage. She gave it to him because to refuse would have been a provocation she was not yet ready to make, and because she needed the time that his presence in the spare room provided to think. She did not sleep well. She lay in her own room and listened to the mountains settle in the cold, and thought with the focused, methodical attention she brought to the planning of large meals through every aspect of what Arthur had come to do and what she needed to do about it. The way station was hers by deed. She had the document. But Arthur was right about one thing, not in the way he had intended it, but in the factual sense that railroad acquisition proceedings involve legal complexity that could be exploited by a man with the resources to retain lawyers and the willingness to use procedural delay as a pressure tactic. He would not argue ownership directly. He was too careful for that. He would offer to help persistently and with apparent generosity until helping became managing, and managing became controlling, and the deed remained technically in her name, while everything it represented passed into his hands. She had watched him do this with other men's investments in Denver. She had not at the time understood she was watching a methodology. She understood it now. He came to find her the next morning while she was preparing the breakfast service. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of cornbread baking and salt pork rendering, and he came in and leaned against the doorframe with the ease of a man who still believed himself to be at home anywhere he chose to stand. "I was thinking," he said pleasantly, "that I could reach out to my contact at Denver and Rio Grande on your behalf, simply to open the conversation, get a sense of the offer they are likely to make." "That is kind of you," Martha said without looking up from the skillet. The pleasantness in his voice intensified slightly, the way a man raises his volume when he is not sure he is being heard. "I have relationships there, Martha. Robert Hendricks is an old colleague. He would deal with me in a way he might not deal with," a small pause, another of his architectural pauses, "someone without the same background in these negotiations, someone without the same background." She turned the salt pork and did not answer. "I am trying to help you," he said. The pleasantness had acquired a slightly harder edge. Not anger. Arthur rarely showed anger directly, but the edge of a man who is accustomed to his offers being received as what he presents them as rather than what they are. "You have done something remarkable here, truly. But the next stage requires a different set of skills, and there is no shame in recognizing that. There is no shame in recognizing that." She set down the fork and turned and looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression he had worn in the parlor in Denver on the night he had told her about Cecilia Hartmore. The expression she had been unable to name at the time, but could name perfectly now. Expectation. The expectation of a man who has never genuinely believed that the people he discards will fail to be available when he needs them again. "Arthur," she said in the same flat, informational tone she had used the night before, "you did not come up this mountain because you were worried about me. You came because a railroad survey changed the value of a property you once dismissed as worthless. And you believe that if you stand in my kitchen and speak to me long enough in your particular way, I will eventually hand you what you want, because that is what I have always done." The expression shifted, not to anger, to something more careful. "You are misreading the situation," he said. "I do not think I am," she said. "Martha." His voice changed, softened in the particular way she recognized as the most dangerous gear in his whole machinery, the intimacy gear, the voice that said, "I see you, I know you, we are the only two people who understand each other. I know things have been difficult. I know what I did was wrong. I know that, and I have carried that." He moved toward her slightly, the theater of a man about to lay his chest open. "But you were always strongest with me beside you. You know that. The things you accomplished in Denver, the dinners, the connections, none of that happened without both of us." Martha looked at her former husband. She looked at him with the same clear, assessing attention she had turned on herself in the cracked mirror, without sentiment and without predetermined conclusion. She saw a man who was genuinely brilliant at understanding people's vulnerabilities and genuinely incapable of understanding why using that brilliance the way he did was a form of theft. She saw a man who had taken the most productive and capable years of a good woman's life and spent them in the service of his own advancement and called it partnership. She saw a man who had come up a mountain in spring mud, not for her, but for a deed, and who was now standing in her kitchen trying to convince her that her grief at his betrayal was evidence of her need for him. She felt something leave her in that moment, not with drama. Quietly, the way the last snow leaves a south-facing rock in spring, not melting dramatically, but simply being gone one morning where it was present the day before. The last of whatever power his voice had carried over her internal landscape. It did not make her hate him. It made her, in a way she would think about for a long time afterward, slightly sorry for him. For the smallness of a life organized entirely around the management of other people rather than the building of anything real. "The things I accomplished in Denver," she said, "happened because of my own work and my father's money. The connections were made over tables I set and food I prepared. You were present for those dinners, Arthur. You did not produce them." She picked up the fork and turned back to the stove. "Finish your breakfast and settle your account with Mr. Corbett. He is handling the books this week." There was a long silence behind her. "You are making a mistake," Arthur said. His voice had lost its warmth entirely now. Underneath the warmth, as she had always known, was this a flat, hard, certain tone. The tone of a man accustomed to having the last word. "Perhaps," Martha said. She slid the cornbread onto the board and cut it with the clean, decisive motion of a woman who has kneaded enough dough to know her own strength. "I have survived worse mistakes than whatever you can arrange." She heard him leave the kitchen. She heard his footsteps cross the main room. She heard from somewhere outside the voice of Ezekiel Shaw, low and deliberate, speaking with the specific, measured authority of a man who is choosing every word with the accuracy of someone sighting along a long rifle, and she heard Arthur's footsteps stop. She did not go to the window. She did not need to. She trusted what was happening out there with the same complete, bone-deep certainty with which she trusted the mountain air and the solidity of the hearth she had built, and the knowledge that her deed was real and her work was real, and she herself was real, formidable, and capable, and built for exactly this. She served breakfast to 30 men. The cornbread was excellent. She heard the conversation end before she heard Arthur's horse leave. She knew the shape of it from the kitchen, the way you know the weather from inside a solid building. Not from direct exposure, but from the evidence of it transmitted through walls and sounds and the particular quality of silence that follows something significant. Ezekiel's voice had remained low throughout, never rising to the register of confrontation, because Ezekiel Shaw did not need volume to be heard. He had the authority of a man who speaks infrequently enough that when he does speak, the words have weight from the accumulated quiet behind them. She heard Arthur's voice, once sharp and brief, the sound of a man who has encountered an obstacle he did not anticipate. Then more of Ezekiel's low, measured delivery. Then nothing. Then hoofbeats going down the mountain. Martha cut the remaining cornbread into portions and arranged them on the serving board and carried them to the main room table, and the miners, who had been present through all of it, received their breakfast with the tactful silence of men who understand that some victories are personal and do not require commentary. Corbett caught her eye across the room and gave her a nod that contained in the economic language of a man not given to ceremony everything that needed saying. She nodded back and went to pour the coffee. Ezekiel came inside when the breakfast service was well underway. He moved to the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who has completed a task and moved on to the next one, and Martha followed him after a moment, leaving the serving to the 2 youngest miners who had over the past weeks become reliable in the kitchen rotation. He was at the table with the deed. She had given it to him the previous night after the conversation in the kitchen, and he had sat with it for a long time by the lamp reading it, with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered occasionally, making small notations on the paper he kept folded in his breast pocket. Now he had additional papers spread beside it, documents he had retrieved from his cabin that morning. Survey records and land office filings, and the kind of accumulated documentation that a man accrues when he has spent a decade navigating the legal landscape of mountain property and freight rights. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him. The morning light was coming through the way station's east window. New light, the particular gold of a mountain spring morning that has not yet made any concessions to the harshness of the day ahead. It lay across the table, and across the deed, and across Ezekiel's large, careful hands. And Martha looked at it and felt the same thing she had felt on the morning after the storm broke. All those months ago, the sensation of being at the beginning of something rather than the end. "The deed is solid," Ezekiel said. He touched the document with one finger, indicating the recording mark in the upper corner. "Your father filed it correctly with the Hinsdale County Land Office in 1881. The recording is clean. Continuous ownership, no liens, no competing claims." He paused. "Arthur Pendleton has no legal standing on this property. He never did." "He knows that," Martha said. "That was never his approach. No." Ezekiel looked at the papers before him with the expression of a man examining terrain before a crossing thorough and without illusion. His approach was the railroad option agreement. He met with a Denver and Rio Grande surveyor in Durango 3 weeks ago. "I found the filing at the land office yesterday when I went down." He turned one of his own documents toward her. He was attempting to position himself as an authorized agent for the property negotiation, to sign a preliminary option agreement on your behalf. Martha looked at the document. It was a land office inquiry record, dry and procedural, but its implications were not dry at all. "Can he do that?" she said. "Not without a power of attorney bearing your signature." Ezekiel's voice was steady. "Which he does not have. The agreement he was attempting to arrange would have been unenforceable. But—" He paused, and she heard the weight in that pause, the but that contains the actual problem. An unenforceable agreement signed in bad faith by a man presenting himself as an agent can create what is called a cloud on the title. Not a legal barrier to your ownership, but a procedural complication that can delay a legitimate sale by months or even years while the courts sort the paperwork. "He was not trying to take the deed," Martha said slowly, working it through. "Huayish. He was trying to make it unusable without him." Ezekiel looked at her with the quiet, direct attention he always gave her when she arrived at something true. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what he was doing." She sat with that for a moment. The architecture of it was, she thought, entirely consistent with the man she had been married to. Not a frontal assault, because Arthur did not make frontal assaults. A structural undermining. Make the thing she held technically hers, but practically inaccessible without his involvement, and then present his involvement as the generous solution to a problem he had quietly engineered. It was, in a terrible way, elegant. It was the same methodology he had applied to her sense of self for 7 years. Not destroying her capability, but creating the conditions under which she could not access it without his mediation. "What do we do?" she said. Ezekiel gathered the papers with the practiced economy of a man who has already decided on his course and is ready to move. "I filed a preemptive affidavit of ownership at the land office yesterday morning," he said, "before I came back up the mountain. It places your deeds on formal record as the sole and unencumbered claim to this property with my signature as a witness to the document's history and the property's continuous occupation." He looked at her directly. "It closes the window he was using. Any option agreement he attempts to file now will be rejected on its face because the ownership record is formally established and current." Martha looked at him across the table in the morning light. He had gone down the mountain the previous day, she had thought, for freight business. He had, in fact, spent the day at the land office reading survey filings and constructing the legal protection of her property with the same quiet, unhurried thoroughness with which he had repaired her roof in the deep of winter, doing it before she knew it needed doing it without announcement or requirement of acknowledgement. "You did this yesterday," she said, "before you knew what he was planning to do this morning." "I knew what he was planning before he arrived," Ezekiel said simply. "A man who travels to a mountain property he once abandoned belongs to one of 2 categories: men who come to apologize, and men who come because the property has become valuable. He did not strike me as the first kind." Martha was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was fully established now. the gold light having committed itself to the day, and she could hear the sounds of the way station operating around them, the voices of the miners, the scrape of bench legs on the plank floor, the particular domestic music of a place that is genuinely alive. "Is he finished?" she said. "Or will he try something else from Denver? He may try something else from Denver." Ezekiel said honestly. He did not offer her false comfort, which was one of the things she valued most about him. But his leverage was always personal rather than legal. He had one legal avenue, and it is closed. What remains is whatever he can do with lawyers and delay, and that is a slower game with less certain returns. He folded his papers with the neat precision of a man who respects documents. "I know a land attorney in Durango who handles railroad right-of-way negotiations. A good one. We should engage her before the Denver and Rio Grande makes a formal approach." Martha noted the oui without comment. She filed it in the same careful internal place where she had been filing similar things for months, the accumulated evidence of a man who had quietly and without ceremony begun to speak about her future, as though it were also his, and who appeared to be entirely unconscious of doing so. 2 days later, Arthur Pendleton made his final move. He came back up the mountain, not alone, but with a man from Durango, a legal representative named Cosgrove, who carried a leather satchel and the air of a man accustomed to being effective. They arrived in the late afternoon when the way station was between the midday service and the evening meal, and Arthur walked in with Cosgrove at his shoulder and the particular expression of a man who has regrouped and returned with reinforcements. The main room was not empty. It was never truly empty in those weeks. Corbett was there, and 6 other miners whose camps had fully closed and who had, in the informal way of men who have been genuinely cared for, simply stayed on. They were doing the various tasks of the afternoon, mending equipment, playing cards, engaged in the easy, purposeless conversation of men between labors. They looked up when Arthur came in, and the quality of the room changed in the way it had changed before, that specific attentive stillness. Arthur surveyed the room and found Martha emerging from the back hallway with a bolt of canvas she had been measuring for a repairs project. He placed himself in the center of the room in the manner of a man establishing that the stage was his. "Martha," he said with the gravity of a man delivering news, "I have been advised that there may be irregularities in the land office filing on this property. Mr. Cosgrove here has reviewed the survey records and believes there are grounds for a formal contest of the occupation claim." Cosgrove opened his satchel with the practiced solemnity of a man whose satchel is meant to intimidate. Martha set the canvas bolt on the nearest table. She was aware of every person in the room and of Ezekiel, who had come in from outside at the sound of the horse and was standing near the door with his arms crossed and the quality of contained stillness she had learned to read as the most focused version of him. She looked at Arthur across the room and felt, in addition to the clarity and the cold anger she had carried since his first arrival, something unexpected, a quality of almost restful certainty. The certainty of a person standing on ground they know to be solid. "Mr. Cosgrove," she said, addressing the lawyer directly, and not Arthur. "The deed to this property was recorded correctly in 1881, and a formal affidavit of current and unencumbered ownership was filed with the Hinsdale County Land Office 4 days ago, before Mr. Pendleton's first visit to this property." And she watched the man's expression process this. "You are welcome to inspect the documentation. However, I would suggest that before you proceed, you speak with the land office directly." Cosgrove looked at Arthur. The look of a man who has just understood that the ground of the case he was retained to make is not where he was told it would be. Arthur's expression did not break entirely. He was too controlled for that. But something in the architecture of his confidence shifted a small but visible adjustment, the expression of a man who has played his strongest card and watched it fail to take the trick. Ezekiel moved then, not toward Arthur. He came to the table where Martha stood and set down a folded document beside her hand and said quietly and with great precision, "The land office response to the affidavit came down this morning with the freight delivery, confirmed and recorded." He said it to Martha, not to Arthur. He said it in the tone of a man informing his partner of a business development natural and without performance. Corbett stood up from his bench. He did not do so with aggression. He simply stood, and his considerable height and breadth arranged themselves in the room as a fact. The other miners at the table stood as well, in the unhurried sequential way of men who have made a collective decision without needing to discuss it. 6 men rising to their feet in a quiet room, not threatening, simply present, simply placing themselves between the woman who had fed them and the man who had come to take from her. The room was very still. Arthur looked at the standing miners. He looked at Cosgrove, who was closing his satchel with the quiet efficiency of a man removing himself from an untenable position. He looked at Martha, who had not moved, who stood behind her table in her own establishment, with her hand resting on the confirmed land office document, and met his gaze with the same direct, undeflected attention she had turned on him in the kitchen 2 days before. And for the first time in 7 years of knowing Arthur Pendleton, Martha saw him run out of performance. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see what was underneath it, which was a man who was smaller than his own voice. A man who had required her diminishment to maintain his own sense of scale, and who was standing in the fact of her fullness, her accomplished and legally protected and communally defended fullness with nothing left to say. He left without speaking. Cosgrove followed. The hoofbeats went down the mountain for the second and final time, and this time Martha knew with the bone-deep certainty of a person whose instincts have been restored to working order that they would not come back. Corbett sat back down. He picked up his tin whistle from the table where it had been resting and played a single clean declarative note, and the men around him laughed, and the tension left the room the way weather leaves a mountain all at once and completely. And Martha pressed her hand flat on the land office document and felt it solid and real under her palm, and thought of her father's flour-dusted forearms, and felt something complete itself quietly and without ceremony deep in the locked center of her chest. That evening she and Ezekiel were the last ones in the way station. The miners had gone to their various sleeping arrangements, the spare rooms and the storage loft that had been converted to a dormitory, and the fire in the great central hearth had settled from its working height to the lower, steadier burn of a fire that is no longer performing any function except the ancient and sufficient one of keeping back the dark. Martha was at the work table with the account books recording the day's transactions in the methodical way she had taught herself over the winter, and Ezekiel was at the bench near the hearth with a piece of wood in his hands, working it with a small chisel in the unhurried way he worked at things when there was no particular urgency, the way a man works when he is content. She had noticed the piece of wood over the past several evenings. It was oak dense-grained and dark, and he had been shaping it with a patience that she recognized as the patience he brought to things he cared about. She had not asked about it. She was learning still the difference between things Ezekiel would tell her in his own time and things that could be asked. "What are you making?" she said. He looked up from the wood. His face in the firelight had the quality it always had, at the end of a day settled and clear, the face of a man who has done what needed doing and is at peace with the account. He considered the piece of wood in his hands for a moment, and then set it on the bench and said, "An armchair." Martha looked at him. "For the corner by the south window," he continued, in the manner of a man being specific for the sake of accuracy. "The light is good there in the morning. The proportions of the chair are a pause in which she recognized him choosing words with the care he always brought to saying important things designed for someone specific, for comfort rather than convention. She understood what he meant, not as a courtesy or a practical accommodation. as a declaration made in wood and craft, and the specific intelligence of a man who had looked at her, all of her, and determined that she deserved a place in the world built to hold her exactly as she was. The fire settled. The mountain was quiet outside in the way of mountain nights in late spring, the absolute quiet that people from cities find either terrifying or holy, depending on their relationship with themselves. Martha closed the account book. "Ezekiel," she said. He looked at her from the bench with those autumn sky eyes that she had been looking into for 7 months, through a winter and a building and a battle, and the slow, patient process of becoming herself again, and she saw in them what she had been seeing for months without allowing herself to fully receive it. Not hunger, though the warmth of it was there, not pity, which had never been there at all. The same thing she had seen in the chair he was building, a design completed around her specific dimensions. The particular, deliberate, chosen regard of a man who had looked at everything she was and found not excess, but abundance. "I have not said," she began, and stopped because the right words were taking a moment to arrange themselves, and she was no longer afraid of the space a moment requires. "I arrived on this mountain with nothing but a deed to a ruin, and 7 years of being told I was less than I was. And you—" She stopped again. She looked at the fire and then looked back at him. "You built me a roof before I knew I needed one. You filed papers to protect what was mine before I knew it was threatened. You gave me the warmest space in a small cabin and slept on the floor all winter and acted as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world." Ezekiel watched her without interrupting. He had the quality in moments like this of a mountain in good weather, entirely present, taking nothing away from what was happening by being anything other than exactly what he was. "I am not less than I was told," Martha said. "I know that now. I knew it before today, but today I knew it the way you know a thing when you have stood in it under pressure, and it has held." She looked at her own hands on the closed account book, the strong and capable and flower-familiar hands of a woman who has built something real. "I wanted to say that to you, because you were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw it before I could see it myself." The fire spoke quietly. Somewhere outside a night bird made its single note and was answered by the wind in the high pines. Ezekiel set the chisel down on the bench. He rose from his seat in the unhurried way. He did everything the way of a man who has never needed to rush toward things that are genuinely his, and came to the table and stood before her. And in the firelight she could see the scar along his jaw, and the serious, steady depth of his eyes, and the expression on his face, which was not the performance of feeling, but the real and unguarded fact of it. "Martha," he said. His voice was lower than usual, not with uncertainty, but with the register of a man speaking from a place he does not often give access to. "I have spent 10 years on this mountain because I found it to be the only place that did not ask me to be less than I was, the only honest place." He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, and the waiting was not difficult. "And then you came out of that storm, and you were the most honest thing I had ever seen, not because you were unbroken, because you were broken and still here, because the cold took everything and you still held on to that deed, because in my cabin half frozen you said thank you and meant it as a true thing." He looked at her directly in the way she had come to know was him at his most serious, without any deflection or management. "I have been watching you rebuild yourself all winter. I have watched you take a ruin and make it into something alive. I have watched you stand in your own kitchen and refuse a man who had every reason to believe you would give him what he wanted." A pause. "And I love every particular and formidable inch of you. not in spite of the way you are made. Because of it. Your softness is not a flaw. It is not something to be corrected or reduced. It is. He stopped finding the word with the care he brought to finding the right cut in a piece of wood. It is where I want to put down what I have been carrying, if you will have me. Martha Collins looked at Ezekiel Shaw in the firelight of the hearth she had built in the way station that was hers, by deed and by labor and by the fierce surviving will that had gotten her out of Denver and up a mountain in a blizzard and through a winter and a rebuilding and a battle, and felt the last locked room in her chest open, not with violence, not with the drama of a thing long withheld, but with the simple, irresistible ease of a door built true swinging wide on well-made hinges. She stood up. She was not a small woman, and she did not move like one. She moved like what she was, a powerfully built and wholly present person, crossing the small distance between herself and the man who had told her the truth about herself when she had forgotten how to tell it herself. She put her hand against his chest, above the scar on his jaw, against the warm solidity of him that she had first felt in the dark during the storm, when she was too cold to know what warmth meant, and she felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady and real, and she looked up at him and said simply, "Yes." He put his arms around her with the same quality of intention he brought to everything he built, carefully, thoroughly, as though he had considered the dimensions and was certain they were right. The fire in the hearth of the Hargrove way station held steady through the night, the way good fires do when they have been properly laid, giving light and warmth in equal measure to everything within their reach. Outside, the San Juan Mountains stood in their ancient and indifferent dark peaks, still white with the last of the winter, against a sky full of stars that had watched over this particular pass for longer than the memory of any living thing. In the morning, Martha made biscuits. Ezekiel brought in wood. Corbett played his tin whistle at the breakfast table while the others ate, and the sound of it went out through the open door into the mountain air, and down the pass road and into the new day, with the particular carrying quality of music in high places going farther than the player knows. The way station ran. It continued to run through the spring and into the summer, adapting as the mountain adapted, taking in freighters and late-season miners, and eventually, as the survey work confirmed what Ezekiel had already understood about the railroad route, becoming a negotiating table for the right-of-way agreement that Martha signed, in August alone, with her own signature, for a sum that made the Durango land attorney smile, for the first time in what appeared to be a professional career characterized by restraint. The armchair was finished in June. Oak, wide and low, and built with the specific intelligence of a man who had studied what comfort actually meant, not the decorative approximation of it, but the real thing. It stood in the corner by the south window where the morning light was good, and it fit Martha precisely. Which is to say, it fit her completely, which is to say that when she sat in it with her coffee and her account books and the mountain view, through the window it held her, the way the mountains held the valley without question, without qualification, as though it had always been exactly the right size, and she had always been exactly the right person to fill it. Ezekiel was at the table across the room when she sat in it for the first time. She ran her hand along the smooth oak armrest and looked at him, and he was watching her with that expression she now knew as the unguarded version of him, the version that existed in the private hours of the way station, when the work was done and the fire was low, and they were simply two people who had built something together and were content in the building of it. "It fits," she said. He said with the simplicity of a man who measured once and cut accordingly, "I knew it would." Martha looked out the south window at the peaks, which were beginning to show bare rock above the timberline as the summer asserted itself, and drank her coffee, and felt beneath her and around her the solid, deliberate, lovingly constructed fact of a chair, built to hold her exactly as she was, and thought of all the rooms she had spent her life trying to be smaller than, and thought of her father's hands, and thought of the deed still in its place, recorded and confirmed and entirely hers, and felt the deep and unperformative satisfaction of a woman who has come through the worst of it and arrived without apology at the life that was always waiting for her on the other side of the storm. Outside, the San Juan Mountains kept their ancient counsel as they always had, respecting what was substantial and enduring, which is the only thing mountains have ever known how to respect. And inside the way station the hearth burned, and the partnership held, and the woman at the south window was for the first time in as long as she could remember exactly the size of her own life.